Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Camille Klimlin-Tooten, and I have the privilege of serving as the Commissioner for the United States Bureau of Reclamation. Happy World Water Week. It is a privilege to be a part of the global conversation about the important resource of water. Part of our talk today, along with my colleagues, is to talk about our role in managing water across the 17 Western United States and how we support the nation as well as the world. We ground our ability to manage water and meet our mission of delivering water and producing power in our people, our partnerships, and investments. And today we're going to focus on how we manage water in the extremes. My colleague, Dr. Ken Nowak, will pull up some slides and we will talk through some of this today. So you just go to slide 2. So today I'm joined by Dr. Ken Nowak and Alva Morgan, and we will be talking about our work across the American West of the Bureau of Reclamation. But first, a little bit about the Bureau of Reclamation. Perhaps you haven't heard of us, but you certainly have heard of the values that we bring to the country of the United States and to the world, including some that you're familiar with. If you've ever seen the lights of the Las Vegas Strip, if you've had a glass of water in the city of Phoenix, Arizona, if you've eaten fruits or nuts from the Central Valley of California, if you've been out on a boat in Lake Powell in Arizona, those are the values and products and services that we provide for the American West. We were founded 121 years ago with a very simple mission: to produce water, or to deliver water and produce hydropower. It started with serving our agricultural community. Today, we serve 140,000 farmers with 10 million acres of irrigated land across the United States. We also serve some of the most productive farmland in the United States in the Central Valley, Fresno County, Tulare County, and Madera County being one of the most productive regions within the United States. We also help to serve water to many communities across the West, whether it's Las Vegas that I've mentioned, or Phoenix, Los Angeles, and Denver. And within the Colorado River Basin, 40 million people. We also help to support ecosystems, including the Grand Canyon on the Colorado River system. And we take seriously our responsibility as trustees to the sovereign nations that call the West their home since time immemorial. So what we're going to talk about today is what we're seeing from when we were founded 121 years ago to what the hydrology has served in the last 20 years, including in the last 2 years. A good example would be in California, where we saw the 3 driest years on record, starting from 2020 to 2022, only to be followed this year with nearly 24 atmospheric rivers. And so it is in these managing of extremes that we are working together to help to continue to meet our mission across the West and in service to our nation. I'm happy to turn it over at this time to Ken, who will go through some of the science that we're using as part of managing water in the West.
Thanks very much, Commissioner Tooten. For our topic of managing water in extremes, we'll be splitting our presentation here into 2 sections. The first, how is climate change impacting water managers? I'll be covering this portion. And then my colleague, Alva Morgan, will speak to what Reclamation is doing to help address these challenges. So for this first portion, we'll talk first about historical trends we've seen since Reclamation's inception at the turn of the century. We'll also talk about projected future changes in climate. I'll discuss some recent extremes, some of which our commissioner just alluded to, and then finally conclude with implications for water management in the Western United States. So beginning with historical trends, looking at temperature, we have two plots here showing maps of the United States. The first on the left showing average warming by decade in degrees Fahrenheit, beginning in 1895, going to 2020. And then the one at the right showing the last 30 years. And what we've seen is that in the long term, we've been warming by about a quarter degree F or so per decade. But that rate has actually accelerated in the most recent 30 years. And that may be counterintuitive, but it's mostly due to the scale of the color bars here, where we're actually seeing about a half degree warming per decade in the most recent 30 years. And so warming is really important consideration for us as a water management entity. All things being equal, warmer conditions typically mean less water availability, increased demand for water, and also increased demand for energy. So that power portion of our mission is also tied to warming temperatures. And so this is something that has a direct impact on us. And of course, we expect will continue to warm going forward. Now pivoting to the same type of decadal changes or trends. On the left, the long term, on the right, the last 30 years. But this time looking at precipitation. And so in the long term, we've seen less of a persistent trend, but more recently, we've seen significant drying in the Western United States, of course, California being most notable there, but also some of the most productive, meaning the most runoff generating portions of the Colorado River Basin also being impacted by drying. And so reduced precipitation over the past 30 years, coupled with that increasing trend in temperature, that warming, that's really been a recipe for some historic droughts for us over the past 20 years. And we continue to manage through some of them, most notably the one on the Colorado River. And so these trends are harbingers of what we expect in the future. And so Reclamation has been very active in terms of not only tracking those trends, but also looking to the future. What do we expect future change will bring? And a lot of that work leverages the efforts from the World Climate Research Program, where they coordinate these climate modeling intercomparison project experiments, where these modeling centers get together and all conduct similar modeling projections. And those data get utilized across the globe in a variety of applications. But most notable is perhaps the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change's assessment reports. And so their fourth assessment report was informed by the vintage of climate model projections that are often referred to as CMIP-3. And then the next set of projections were CMIP-5, which informs the fifth assessment report. And then the most recent set of projections are CMIP-6, used in the AR6 report. And I mention this because I want to get some of that jargon out of the way for a few slides that'll be coming in the future, but also to acknowledge that Reclamation is actively engaged in the beneficiary of this global climate modeling enterprise, where we're seeking to get the best available consensus science to inform our management and our planning. And so what we have here is some analysis that we did as a report to our Congress that we have to do every 5 years on the climate and climate change of the Western United States, specifically focused on water resources. And so on the left panel, what we're looking at is drought duration over the historical period, where we used reconstruction proxy data to establish a baseline. What are the average drought durations across this region? And you can see that maybe like 1 to 3 years is the average duration over that roughly 500-year baseline. But then when we look at the CMIP-5 climate projections, and we look at what we think the average duration of drought will be going forward over the next century, we see that we're seeing longer drought duration on average, going from 1 to 4 to probably in the 3 to 7 year length, more of those oranges and red colors in the right panel. And so it's important to note that these are average changes, average drought duration. We fully have seen longer droughts in the historical period, and we fully expect to see longer droughts in the future period. And we know this with confidence because, as we mentioned earlier, we're actively managing through a 20+ year long drought on the Colorado River. And so think of this not as where the drought's going to be, but rather what is the trend in terms of duration that we're expecting to see. And it's towards a longer drought on average. Now, as I mentioned, the most recent set of climate projections are the CMIP-6 projections. The work I showed on the previous slide was based on CMIP-5. That's what was available when we produced that report to Congress. And so I just wanted to take a moment to say, did the story change? Were there radical differences between this latest set of climate projections and the ones that we were just looking at a moment ago? And so what we have here are two scatter plots. On the x-axis, we're looking at temperature change in degrees C. On the y-axis, we're looking at precipitation change. And each dot on this scatter plot represents projected change from one climate model scenario, one model run. And the red dots are from the CMIP-5 data, and then the blue dots are from the CMIP-6. And if you look left to right, the only difference between those two panels are the time window. So we have like the near future, the next 30 years, and then the far future, end of century at right. And so from a quick visual inspection, CMIP-5 and CMIP-6 are showing a very similar pattern, a very similar story. There's no radical change from one vintage to the next. What we see is that all of the climate projections show warming. The question is only how much warming and by when. When we look at precipitation, we see that there's a range from both the CMIP-5 and CMIP-6, ranging from a modest decrease to a small increase, both at the near future and far future. And so it's important to note that on average, they do show a little bit of wettening across the Western U.S. But I think it's important to take that with a grain of salt. And so to highlight why that is, we'll go to this next slide here. And what we're looking at is now a spatial representation of the average precipitation change near end of century, so near 2100, green indicating areas that on average are showing a little bit of wettening, brown showing a little bit of drying. But what I really want to draw your attention to is actually the black hatching, because that's the area where there's low model agreement or high uncertainty. And that's really the important part here is we're talking about modest changes where we don't have great confidence. And so when we look at recent trends and we look at the confidence in warming, we feel, fairly certain that we're going to see more of these drought type conditions, more of these longer droughts. This potential bit of wettening is not going to overcome or compensate for some of those other factors. The other thing that's really important is that these are long-term average changes, and they don't address a number of really key factors that get to the core of this managing for extremes. It doesn't get at the timing of when this precipitation is falling. It doesn't get at the phase of the precipitation. Is it snow? Is it rain? What is it? And most importantly, it doesn't talk about the extremes, which we fully expect to increase with time. And so even though you might on average be getting possibly a little more precipitation, if it's coming as extremes that are hard to capture and hard to fully beneficially use, that means less practical water availability as opposed to just average water availability. And so to highlight that, I'd like to talk a little bit about some recent extremes that we've experienced and bring that home. And so on the temperature front, I think most people are aware globally, July of this year set records for being warmest temperatures on the globe. Well, we also experienced that in the southwestern United States. The map on the right shows average temperature departure from the long-term average over a 45-day period beginning July the 1st. And so for 45 days, you're seeing how much on average were you above or below the average seasonal temperature. And so for southern parts of our domain in the Western United States, we're seeing on average 6, 7, 8 degrees above average in portions of that domain, which is really incredible when you think about it. To bring that home even a little bit more quantitatively, the bar chart at left is showing in red the daily observed high temperatures at the airport in Phoenix, Arizona. Now, Phoenix is obviously a warm place to begin with. And this time of year, the average high temperature is about 106 degrees. Well, for the entire month of July, we were well above that average high. And in some cases, way above it, 119, 118, 117 degrees. The only day that wasn't above 110 on high was July the 31st. And so we've very much seen some of these extreme temperature periods in the southwestern U.S. As well as, of course, across the globe. So now stepping a little bit away from the within the year extremes to year-to-year extremes, the commissioner mentioned in her opening remarks that California in particular had seen record low precipitation for 3 years, 2020, 2021, and 2022. And so the left panel here is showing snow extent, as well as the liquid water content of that snow by the color on April 1st. Now in the Western U.S., April 1st has been a historically good time to look at how much snow has accumulated over the winter season before it starts to melt. And so you can see on the left, we have a very small amount of snow, and the liquid water content is in that kind of pink or even purple range, meaning not a ton of liquid water content. And then we contrast it with this year, April 1st, 2023. It's a radically different picture. We went from essentially a scarcity of water to effectively a surplus of water. You can see that the extent is significant, as well as the coloration all the way up into those white colors, meaning just a ton of liquid water content in that snowpack. And so these types of year-to-year changes are really significant as a water management agency. You'll go from perhaps not having enough water to having almost too much water to effectively manage and put it to beneficial use. And not only does it affect us, but it affects our customers, the folks who are growing food and delivering water to cities. It makes that job so much more difficult. And then just to drive this home even more so, since we're talking about California, if you've been looking at the news at all, Southern California in the United States is experiencing its first hurricane in over 80 years, I think, and they're going to receive perhaps close to a year's worth of precipitation in a few days. That type of precipitation intensity is difficult to capture and effectively use. So when we look at changes in precipitation, it's really important to understand those extremes and how they're going to pose challenges for management, not just the big picture, long-term trends, which can sometimes hide the real story, which in this case are the extremes. So just to conclude a little bit in terms of where we are today, where we were a year ago, from Reclamation's perspective, we have end of water year 2022 on the left panel. We have conditions as of about a few days ago last week in the right panel. The coloration in the background of this map refers to our United States drought monitor. So the colors are indicating some level of drought, with the lighter colors being more modest drought, and then the darker colors being more severe drought. And then the teacups are simply representations of either a reservoir or a system of reservoirs. When the teacup is full to the top in blue, it means the reservoir is full or the system is full. And then the red dashed line is a long-term 30-year average of where that reservoir has been for this time of year. And so you can see this time of year last year, many of our reservoirs were below average. Many of them were not even close to being where they've been or where we might like them to have been, largely due to those historically low snowpack conditions. When we look at the right panel, what we see is that significant portions of the Western U.S. have improved. Some of our reservoirs are above average, in particular in parts of California, which is encouraging for sure. However, there are portions that are still below average. There are portions that did not have the banner winter that California did. And then when we look at the Colorado, we had 150% of average runoff this year due to that snowpack, but those reservoirs still have only modestly improved. They'll need several years of above average conditions to really fully recover. And so in closing, I think the extremes are really critical. They're going to drive how these systems fare. But it's also important to realize that, we don't have a homogeneous system. It doesn't all respond in the same way. We have portions that are still in drought, despite many regions having a good year in terms of snowpack. And so when we think about climate change, temperature and precipitation, it's not a question of if we're going to experience drought in the Western U.S., but really where. And so we continue to invest in strategies and infrastructure that's going to help us to manage these types of conditions. And I'd like to turn it over to Aubrey here to tell you more about those things.
Thanks, Ken, for walking us through really leading with the best available science, reacting to what we see in the hydrology. And I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Opera Morgan, to talk about the solutions here. Reclamation has been provided significant funding as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act to be able to start to use these tools. This is part of President Biden's Investing in America agenda. How do we combat what we're seeing now to be able to make investments that provide for a sustainable future, especially in managing of water resources? So I'd like to turn it over to my colleague Avra to talk about what we're doing.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Ken. I will talk in the next few slides about some of the approaches that Reclamation is undertaking to help water managers within our own agency and also with the stakeholders who we engage with regularly in the Western United States to manage water through these extremes. Next slide. Our approach begins really internally with our own agency in terms of building our ability to have new methods and tools to manage water through extremes and in a variable hydrologic situation that we're seeing these days. And also to communicate those tools and the information across our agency. To begin with, Reclamation has a climate change adaptation strategy, and our actions are focused around 4 goals: increasing water management flexibility in terms of our operations, and enhancing climate change adaptation planning by starting at the early stages of planning to consider how climate change may impact the projects that we're designing and the solutions that we identify. Improving infrastructure resiliency, really all the way from construction to operations and maintenance of our infrastructure. We need to be thinking about how climate change is changing the materials we use, the longevity of the infrastructure, and our approaches to managing it. And finally, expanding information sharing both inside our agency and outside of our agency with our stakeholders. This refers to gathering the best available information on climate change and making that available to folks that are trying to plan and operate water management facilities in the West. Next slide. Reclamation has developed a community of practice to help us develop best practices from within our agency. Like everyone else, we have traditionally relied on the past century or so of historic records of hydrology to help guide many of our workflows, many of our decision-making processes for how we construct facilities, how we evaluate the safety of our dams, how we even manage our water contracts. And knowing now that the past is not a reliable roadmap for the future, is one thing, but developing approaches and methodologies to consider the variability of the current climate in our decision-making processes is another. So our Reclamation's community of practice is focused on developing these best practices and helping to share those, both within our agency and also with our stakeholders. Next slide. The following couple of slides show how we engage with some of the people that we work with in the Western United States, including tribes, cities, counties, irrigation and water districts, and states. This slide showcases our basin study program, which is one of our planning programs that is important to us in terms of establishing a baseline for how climate change is impacting us. Through these studies, we work collaboratively with our stakeholders within the basin to understand the impacts of climate change to water supply and demand, and give everybody a common understanding of the hydrology within the basin. We also, through these studies, develop what we call adaptation strategies, or strategies for managing imbalances between water supply and demand going forward. This slide highlights the American River Basin study in California and shows that in that study, they found a projected imbalance between water supply and demand by about 125,000 to 230,000 acre feet by the year 2070. And some of that is being driven for sure by the phenomena that Ken Nowak before me mentioned, including these changes in the timing and amounts of snowfall and precipitation and runoff. Some of the strategies that were identified through that study include infrastructure development, groundwater banking, all the way to how do we shore up our contract water deliveries. Next slide. We are identifying new tools to optimize reservoir operations in a changing climate. We have several programs in place, including programs that focused on improving our snow forecasts and monitoring technologies. We also have programs that address the need for improved forecasting tools, which is one of the needs that you will hear about the most if you talk to any water manager in the Western United States. The ability to understand the water supply forecasts in this changing climate is critical. Reclamation also has reservoir operations pilots to allow our reservoir operators to look at these new innovations in forecasting and advanced modeling tools to try to see if there are ways that we can operate our reservoirs to manage water better in changing conditions. And in hydropower, we are using advanced decision support tools to help us maximize or optimize the generation of hydropower even under the lowest flow conditions. So how can we get the most power generation from every drop of water? Next slide. Forecast-informed reservoir operations, or FIRO, is one example of an approach that is useful, and when it's able to be implemented at a reservoir can really help water managers cope with some of the changes and the variability in water supplies that we're seeing. Forecast-informed reservoir operations relies more on forecasting water supplies than relying on the traditional approach of rule curves, which were developed based on past hydrologic information that may have changed. So FIRO offers reservoir operators tools to operate in a more dynamic way. This slide shows an example from Lake Mendocino in California of using FIRO for operations. And in this example, here you can see that water managers using FIRO were able to maintain more water in the reservoir while still managing for flood space. In this case, they were able to gain an additional 20% of capacity for storage by managing more based on the forecasts that we're seeing than on those static rule curves that have existed over time. Next slide. Infrastructure, as our Commissioner Tootin mentioned, we've seen an enormous support for investment in climate resilient infrastructure under the Biden administration through the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act. This includes infrastructure projects that increase safety and resilience of infrastructure under climate change, water recycling projects, water and energy efficiency projects that can save water or capture additional benefit from hydropower generation, and projects that are focused on ecological benefits. This photo here shows the Bryant-Kern Canal, which is in California in the Central Valley, and where the extended droughts that the speakers before me described have resulted in increased groundwater pumping that is resulting in land subsidence and interfering with the ability of the canal to use gravity to deliver water. In this case, through the bipartisan infrastructure law, Reclamation and our partners are building sections of canal parallel to the existing canal to be able to handle water deliveries and improve water deliveries in those areas. And in the design, we're accounting for some additional subsidence to occur in the future, while at the same time there are measures underway in California to curb groundwater pumping that will result in subsidence. Next slide. So with infrastructure, climate change can impact almost every aspect, from the design and the materials and even the construction schedule that we have to the operation of the infrastructure and our maintenance and repairs to that infrastructure. So some of the things that Reclamation has underway to address these issues include developing climate-informed projections of future flood hazards so that we can build climate resilience into our safety of dams risk analyses, new focus on incorporating climate change impacts early in the planning phases of projects and also in the design of projects. In terms of hydropower, maybe our most prominent design example is the use of wide head turbines at Hoover Dam that have been used to help us continue to be able to generate hydropower at a broader level of lake levels. So when water is low, these wide head turbines enable us to continue to generate power where we otherwise wouldn't be able to. The photo here shows a project funded by the infrastructure bill at BF Sisk Dam in San Luis Reservoir. This is a safety of dams project that is shoring up an earthen berm to prevent overtopping when there's seismic activity, but also adds a significant amount of water through a dam raise in California. I think it's 10 feet of 10 feet high dam raise, which is 130,000 acre feet in this area that has been experiencing drought due to climate change, extended drought. Next slide. Water reuse and recycling is a really important tool in managing through climate change because it allows us to use wastewater or other impaired water to create a new and local water source. And we have also seen great support for this program through the recent infrastructure laws. We cost share with project sponsors to develop these large water reuse and recycling projects. It's critical partnership between us and non-federal cities and other entities that manage water. Under a typical water reuse and recycling project that we've funded in the past, we can expect to gain up to 50,000 acre feet. Through our expanded program that we're implementing now, which we call large-scale water recycling, we're expecting to see projects that can produce up to 3 times that amount, so up to 150,000 acre feet in some cases. Next slide. Our system conservation program in the Colorado River Basin is a very important part of how we are addressing water shortages. There's been historic shortfalls in the Colorado River system, and our stakeholders and the 7 basin states are coming together and partnering with Reclamation on this system conservation program, which is innovative in that we're providing direct compensation for conserved water We pair that with investments to mitigate any negative impacts of system conservation to the communities and to the environment. Stakeholder engagement is critical to this effort. And in going forward in phase 2, we'll focus on system efficiencies for long-term water savings to the Colorado River system. Nature-based solutions are another approach that is being emphasized in our programs and through the latest authorities and funding that we've received from Congress. These can include the use of green and gray infrastructure to restore natural processes and systems, which can help build resilience to climate change. This includes things like reconnecting rivers to their floodplains, expanding wetlands, removing barriers to fish passage, and even strategically relocating diversion structures to help control water temperatures or flows for ecological benefits. Next slide. These are just a couple of examples of some of the nature-based solutions projects that we have implemented. On the left here, you can see the Laguna Division Conservation Area. This is a terraced flood control area that helps us manage flood flows while at the same time creating a large and vibrant ecosystem. This is right on the Colorado River in the California border area. And of course, another benefit of these nature-based solutions is often carbon capture through increased wetlands. The other slide on the right photo on the right shows you the Battle Creek Ecological Restoration Project at Sowogani. This is a project in collaboration with the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation. And this is an effort to restore channelized sections of the river at the location of the Bear River Massacre. The project is focused on restoring river function and also providing fish passage in the same area. Next slide. That concludes our presentation. Thank you very much for joining us, and we are happy to answer some questions.
I think we have a first question here, and perhaps Ken, you can start. It asks, with stationarity now dead, what are your broad strategies for managing increased unpredictability and uncertainty of the more aggressive climate? How are we adapting?
Sorry about that.
Go ahead, Ken.
Yeah, my pleasure. It's a great question, and it's one that I think we continue to work on. I'm at our research and development office. These types of strategies are certainly things we're investigating. But I think to Aubra's point, better understanding the resource we have to manage, both when it's on the ground in the form of snow or as soil moisture, but also increasing our ability to forecast from days to weeks to even seasons is really where I think we can make improvements. We can make better operational decisions with better information. And to Aubra's point, when you can fully leverage those enhancements in your operations in frameworks like FURO, that really is a winning combination of advancing science and understanding with changes in operations. And so, yeah, I think those are the sorts of things that we can bring to the table. The other thing I'll just mention is on the climate scale, trying to move away from solutions that are optimized for what we think the future is, but rather solutions that perform well over a range of future conditions so that we're not boxed into one future because we thought that's what was going to happen.
Aubra, did you want to add to that as well?
I would just add that we are also developing guidance for decision-making, essentially risk-based decision-making in our day-to-day workflow processes. So considering how to, like Ken said, identify a range of futures that we can use to actually make a determination, like how high to build the dam, things that typically in the past were based on very kind of concrete, black and white data. We are having to instead engage a risk-based decision-making process that allows us to consider a range of conditions, a range of risks, and how to kind of adapt our approach to these decisions we're trying to address that through the development of guidance within our organization to help our engineers and other decision makers work through these kind of dynamic conditions that we're seeing.
Thanks. And I guess to wrap up the last part of your question, Tony, on how do you quickly adapt when you're looking at variations in the models. From a top line perspective, it's being able to communicate clearly and often with the stakeholders of what you're seeing when you're seeing it. So it's a very clear and active dialogue with our partners within the states, within the tribal nations, and all those who are interested. There's a question about local actions. And is there a plan to adjust demand to supply? I'll take that first and then toss it over to Savra because I think she can really talk about that. You know, there have been significant investments in these developments of local water supplies that allow for resiliency within the system. Whether it's water recycling or water smart, which Avra can touch on with the grant program, being able to incentivize these types of actions across all, whether it's localities, municipalities, or the agricultural and industrial community, putting these best practices in place, but also providing the resources is key to those local developments. Avra, did you want to add some detail on that?
Sure. So as the commissioner mentioned, water conservation, water efficiency, and water reuse recycling have been key to our program to address water demands and developing local supplies. Through our Water Smart program, we work directly with stakeholders by cost sharing projects to increase water efficiency through a whole range of activities, from lining unlined canals to increasing the technology that we use to control water deliveries so that we can make precise deliveries for crops, increasing water measurement technologies so that we understand how much water is needed, how much water we're using to irrigate, all the way to our water reuse and recycling projects, which really help create new water supplies from existing sources. So water conservation and efficiency through our Water Smart program, again, we cost share these projects with our local stakeholders, has been very successful, and especially with new influx of funding through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act.
A question regarding a change in dynamics regarding managing within the last 30 years. I'll just talk about it from a hydrologic perspective in managing water and what we're seeing, and we've touched on that on a very top line basis. Over the last 30 years, or certainly over the last 2 decades, we've seen significant changes within the hydrology. When we were founded in 1902, and when these facilities were constructed in the last century, it was the premise that snowpack would serve as our largest reservoir. Within this last 2 decades, we've seen that change significantly, as Ken has touched on his presentation. And so what we're looking to is that the past is no longer indicative of what we see in the future. Back to the initial question of having being static as far as that being stationarity is dead, and our ability to adapt and evolve, but also provide the resources to build onto tools. I think those are all the questions that we have right now. Are there any other questions? We have a little bit more time. What is the Bureau most optimistic about as new tools and resources become available? One of the things that I'm absolutely optimistic about is the level of partnership and collaboration between our different constituencies. One of the conversations that we're having within the Colorado River Basin is a discussion for operations for the Glen Canyon and Hoover Dam for post-2026. And part of that conversation, we were able to convene for the first time a federal, tribe, and state dialogue about how do we do this moving forward. And so one of the things I'm very optimistic about is the level of partnership and engagement that we have, whether it's within the whole of the federal government, but also our partners, and the resource that we're provided to be able to take those ideas and actually have them become actions. Ken, Avra, are there any that you are optimistic about?
I am optimistic about the expansion of our programs focused on ecological benefits. It's just given us more tools in the toolbox to be able to fund large-scale fish passage projects or projects that are focused on nature-based solutions. I think it really helps. It helps expand the types of things we can do and gives folks the expectation that restoring rivers to their more natural conditions will actually help all of us. So I find those projects very exciting. Ken?
Yeah, thanks, Avra. Yeah, I mean, I think we're at a very interesting place in terms of the challenges we face, but to the questions point, what are you optimistic about? We do have a lot of both collaborations and technologies that I think are going to help us going forward. If you look at the rate of technology acceleration, just in recent years in any number of sectors, we've seen a lot of advancements, more of those local supplies coming to bear for communities. And so I think that, those two things put together are a powerful combination to build more resiliency, that engagement and the solutions that we're starting to see really become available.
Avra, this might be a good segue. There was a question about nature-based solutions and more examples.
Yeah, sure. So we have a couple of new programs that have been exciting for us, where we are seeing people bring forward a combination of ideas. That you can see a river restoration project that includes a combination of, let's say, traditional gray infrastructure where perhaps a headgate or a diversion is being relocated so that the flows in the segment downstream are maintained, or temperatures are maintained for habitat purposes, and combining that with the restoration efforts to maintain the natural channel, whether it's keeping the meanders in place instead of having a channelized stream, or putting in, replacing, I guess, invasive vegetation with native vegetation, and kind of a combination of all of those efforts together. So where once the projects that we would fund were very much focused on conserving water and leaving water in stream, we're still doing that, But now we're seeing, in addition to that, people coming to the table with multiple different types of partners, agricultural, tribal, kind of community type conservation organizations, agricultural water users, partnering together and all receiving benefits from these types of projects that may include a combination of different approaches. So that's been really interesting for us, and we're hoping to see more of it. Of course, your traditional nature-based solution tends to be things like analog beaver dams that can help control water temperatures and also the natural flow of the stream. Reconnecting floodplains to wetlands is very important because it's a natural form of flood control, and also builds up our wetlands, which are great at helping with carbon and also creating ecosystems. So we're just seeing very dynamic projects lately that employ a wide range of these different tools.
We have a few more minutes, and there's just a few more questions. There's a question here about finding a balance regarding reservoirs and finding the balance between what the benefits are as well as working through the challenges. I think that is something that we do on a daily basis as we operate these facilities. How do you allow for the management of these reservoirs, which provide significant water resources to agricultural, industrial, and certainly municipal entities, but also balance within that the demands of the ecosystem, including, aquatic species. And so whether it's on the Colorado River or in the Central Valley Project, that is something that we're certainly mindful of being able to take into account how our operations impact all of the different values that we try to provide. I think there's another question here about other countries with water problems, and specifically in Mexico. First, I want to immediately flag that Mexico is an important partner for us, especially within the Colorado River conversation. We deliver 1.5 million acre feet to the country of Mexico as part of the treaty for the Colorado River. And so it is important to have a continued dialogue there on how we manage the system, and just grateful for that partnership with Mexico. Regarding engagements with other countries, we're really proud of this part of our mission where we have an international program. Just last week, we actually hosted several countries for the international safety evaluation of dams at Hoover Dam in Las Vegas, Nevada. So we're very proud of our ability to be able to exchange information, share best practices and lessons learned, and please reach out to us. We can provide a contact there on how we can work together. And then, is there anything, Avra, Ken, you'd like to add to those 2 points?
There's a request for a quick lesson for other countries with less resources and low data. And Ken, I think you're probably the best person to address this. I know there's so much available, on publicly available websites. I would think that that's one place to look, but also the local community organizations have really made a lot of progress, even in countries with a lot of resources. So, not taking for granted those local efforts as being very valuable. But Ken, do you have more to add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Avra. Data is really foundational to any sort of resource management. It enables you to make decisions with confidence. It provides the basis of transparency to the people you're working with. And so I really appreciate the question, because it is something that I think is really critical, both for informing good decisions, but also for that communication and transparency piece when you come to management of such a critical resource. When it comes to countries with less resources, perhaps less monitoring and less data or less records. One of the exciting things is that with the advent of new technologies like remote sensing, there's some really exciting work in the satellite space where data is being collected across the globe in standard ways, and there's great communities around using those data sets. And so even though there may not be monitoring going on the ground in a particular location, there may be ways to get at that information by using satellites or other approaches. And so in some ways, it's very exciting to think about the opportunities we have in terms of access to data. It's only going to continue to grow as we have more of these missions launched either by our space agencies or by the private sector. And so, I think that's a great start. The other thing is, we have a prize competition program, which is essentially crowdsourcing at Reclamation. And we've invested in competitions where we're trying to lower the cost of some of these monitoring technologies so that they can be deployed more easily, easier to maintain, and lower that barrier to entry to start getting some of those data networks going. And so, I think there's just going to be a lot of opportunities as these things become more robust.
I think we're nearing our time here. And just first, I want to thank my colleagues, Ken Nowak and Avra Morgan, for joining today. We are just 3 of the 5,400 that make up the Bureau of Reclamation in serving the American West. And also, we're proud of our role of being a global leader in how you manage water and continue to produce power in the extreme. And so if you're here at Global Water Week, please say hello. And certainly if we can be of assistance, please reach out to us. Thank you for taking the time to learn about what we do. And we look forward to continuing this dialogue today, but certainly in the next days and weeks and months to come. So thank you very much for joining us today. And I look forward to talking again soon.